Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to the grand castles or epic battlefields you see in the movies, but to a place far more real and, let's be honest, a lot less glamorous, a medieval tavern. Imagine the year is roughly 1350. The sun has dipped below the horizon, and a chill has crept into the air. You're trudging along a narrow, unpaved street, your boots sinking into the slick mud. The only light comes from the moon and the occasional flickering torch spilling out of a nearby window. The air is a thick soup of smells: damp earth, horse manure, wood smoke, and something vaguely rotten. You hear a raucous sound ahead, a mixture of loud chatter, boisterous laughter, and the off-key wail of a lute. A wave of exhaustion washes over you, and the thought of a warm fire and a mug of ale sounds like the most heavenly thing in the world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are right now and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you get closer, the building seems to materialize out of the gloom. It's nothing like a modern pub. This is a squat, timber-framed structure, maybe a two-story building with a thatched roof that sags a little in the middle. The only sign it's a tavern is a simple, painted wooden sign hanging crookedly over the door, a crudely drawn tankard or maybe a sheaf of wheat. A warm, yellow light streams from the single, small window, illuminating the swirling dust and smoke that billows out. You can hear a song being belted out, the words slurred and joyful. You step over the high threshold, pushing aside a heavy, dark wood door. It groans on its hinges, and the cacophony inside swells to meet you. The air hits you like a brick wall, a dense mix of wood smoke from the central hearth, stale sweat, damp wool, and the overwhelmingly yeasty smell of fermenting ale. It's a smell that modern noses would probably find pretty overpowering. But to you, it's just the smell of warmth and life. The single room is low-ceilinged and packed. Rough-hewn wooden tables and benches are crammed together, and every single one is full. There's no fancy bar, just a sturdy plank of wood separating the patrons from the barkeep, who is a formidable-looking man with a stained apron and a perpetually scowling face. A massive fireplace crackles on one wall, throwing flickering shadows across the faces of the patrons, some of whom are half asleep, while others are locked in animated conversation. You're an outsider here, but you're mostly ignored, which is a relief. Everyone is too focused on their own business. Historians still argue whether these taverns were truly a refuge for all classes, or if social hierarchies were still rigidly enforced within their smoky walls. You can see the different social strata right away. There's a group of burly, unwashed men in homespun tunics, their calloused hands wrapped around thick ceramic mugs. These are likely the local peasants, seeking a brief escape from the brutal realities of their lives. Over in a corner, a few merchants are hunched over a table, their clothes a little finer, their voices a little more hushed as they discuss business. And near the fire, a couple of soldiers, probably on their way somewhere, are loudly recounting some tale of bravado. This kind of social melting pot was a fairly unique feature of taverns, at least compared to other aspects of medieval life. The lack of proper ventilation means the smoke hangs heavy, stinging your eyes a little. The ground is packed earth, uneven and littered with discarded straw and the occasional puddle of spilled ale. You see a cat slinking along the edge of the room, hopefully hunting for mice. Though you try not to think too hard about the kinds of vermin that must live here, a mainstream historical fact you probably won't survive is the sheer lack of personal hygiene. People just didn't bathe much. A full body bath was a once-a-month luxury for the very wealthy. And for most people, it was closer to once a year. You might have wiped down your face and hands. But that's about it. So, yeah, you'd be pretty rank. A quirky tidbit, though, is that the sawdust or straw on the floor wasn't just for aesthetics. It was to absorb spills and, well, other things, which were then simply swept out the door into the street. Talk about a clean-up crew. You push a little deeper into the room, your eyes adjusting to the low light. The single large room serves as everything: a common area, a dining hall, and even a bedroom for a few unlucky souls who have passed out on a bench. The benches are just split logs, a bit splintery to the touch. The tables are rough planks, scarred and stained from years of spilled drinks and casual carvings. This isn't a place of comfort and cushioned chairs. This is a place of function, a place to get warm, get fed, and get drunk. In that order. There's a constant, low buzz of conversation punctuated by a sudden burst of laughter or the heavy thud of a dropped tankard. The air is so thick with smoke from the fire and cheap tallow candles that it feels almost chewable. You find a free spot on the end of a long bench, giving a polite nod to the burly man on your left who doesn't seem to notice. You're just another shadow in the gloom. The atmosphere is a strange mix of rough-and-tumble chaos and a kind of sleepy camaraderie. Everyone here is escaping something, whether it's the cold, the drudgery of work, or the nagging voices in their head. The bar area is equally simple. It's just a counter with a couple of large wooden barrels behind it, one for ale, one for water, and a few smaller ones for other, less common drinks. You watch as the barkeep, with an almost bored efficiency, fills a mug from a spigot, the liquid pouring out a murky, yellowish-brown. There's no fancy glassware, no ice, just a thick ceramic or wooden tankard. It's probably been used 1,000 times without a proper scrub. You take in the sights. A small dog gnaws on a bone under a table, a few chickens peck at scraps near the hearth, and a lute player in the corner seems to be struggling with a tune, his fingers fumbling with the strings. It all feels so authentically lived in, a place where the edges are worn down not by design, but by constant use. Now, let's talk about the drink itself, that murky liquid you just saw. It's not the crisp, golden lager you might be picturing. This is a small beer, or table beer. It's a low-alcohol brew, often made from the second or third runnings of the mash, because the water quality in medieval cities was notoriously terrible. Remember all those sanitation issues we touched on earlier? People drank a lot of this stuff. A quirky tidbit is that this low-alcohol beer was considered a safe and nutritious alternative to water for people of all ages, including children. A typical medieval person might drink a gallon of it a day. Think about that. You'd be half-buzzed all the time just to stay hydrated. A mainstream historical fact is that brewing was often the responsibility of women. Alewives were common figures in villages, and their homes often doubled as informal taverns. It wasn't until later, as brewing became more commercialized, that it shifted to being a male-dominated trade. Historians still argue whether this shift was a deliberate effort to push women out of a lucrative trade or simply a natural result of urbanization and larger-scale production. As you settle onto the bench, you realize just how little you stand out. You're just another traveler, a face in the crowd. There are no menus, no fancy chalkboards with daily specials. You just get what they have. The silence from the outside is a stark contrast to the lively, if unrefined, atmosphere within. You watch a group of men arm wrestling near the fire, their faces red with exertion. They aren't in it for money, just for bragging rights. In the corner, a couple of young lovers whisper to each other, sharing a single cup. The whole scene feels both foreign and strangely familiar. It's the universal human need for connection and a break from the grind, just played out with a lot more mud and a lot less personal space. You can't help but feel a little bit of the exhaustion from your own long day, a kind of bone-deep fatigue that permeates the room. You watch a merchant count a few coins on the table, their jingling sound a small, metallic punctuation in the low hum of the room. It's an oral tapestry woven from 1,000 different, tiny lives. The smell of the ale, the warmth of the fire, the rough feel of the wood. It all adds up to a very different kind of social experience than what you're used to. It's a place of respite, but not of luxury, and you're grateful for it. With the atmosphere absorbed, you make your way to the counter, waiting for the barkeep's attention. He's a big man with a face like a carved potato and hands like hams, wiping down a rough-hewn surface with a filthy-looking rag. He doesn't look at you, just grunts. You point to a large wooden barrel near the back, signaling that you want a mug of whatever they're serving. There's no menu, no choices, it's just ale. And that's what you get. He takes a large, chipped ceramic mug from a hook, holds it under the spigot, and with a surprisingly swift motion, fills it to the brim. The liquid is a frothy, opaque brown. It looks heavy. The barkeep then holds out his other, less grimy hand, waiting for payment. Now comes the fun part, money. Or, rather, the lack of a standardized system of money. You might have a few coins in your pouch, But what are they? A silver penny? A groat? The coins in circulation would be a hodgepodge of different sizes, values, and even different kingdoms. There's no QR code to scan, no credit card tap. You have to physically produce the coins, and the barkeep has to decide if they're legitimate. He might bite a coin to test its purity. A common practice to check if it's been clipped or filed down. You fish out a few copper and silver coins. He takes them, bites one, and without a word, shoves them into a small leather pouch. The whole transaction is quick, silent, and impersonal. You've paid for your drink, but you have no idea if you've been ripped off or if you got a great deal. Such was the challenge of a non-standardized economy. The concept of a fixed price was pretty rare. The cost of your drink might depend on your social status, your perceived wealth, or even the barkeep's mood that day. A quirkier historical fact about medieval currency is the practice of tally sticks. These were notched sticks used as a form of receipt and debt accounting. A stick would be split lengthwise, with the debtor getting one half and the creditor the other. The notches had to match up perfectly, making forgery nearly impossible. This was a form of accounting that lasted for centuries, even used by the English government for tax collection until the early 1800s. And for a mainstream historical fact, the vast majority of transactions were not in cash at all, but in barter. A peasant might pay for his ale with a handful of eggs, a day's labour, or a promise of help during the harvest. The fluid, chaotic nature of medieval money is something historians still argue about, debating whether it was an inefficient system that stifled trade or a flexible one that allowed for informal commerce to flourish. With the mug in your hand, you turn back to the room. The ale is warm and smells faintly of bread and something a little sour. You're holding a piece of living history in your hand, but it doesn't feel special. It just feels like what everyone else is holding. You take a careful sip. It's not a flavour explosion. It's thin, a little grainy, and definitely not carbonated. But it's wet, it's warm, and it's a lot better than the brackish water from the town well. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from the last episode? This is a little less gross, but not by much. You watch as a man nearby, probably a peasant, hands over a small bundle of firewood in exchange for a few mugs of ale for him and his friends. It's a perfect illustration of the kind of economy you're living in right now, one where a commodity is just as good as a coin. You find your way back to your spot on the bench, mug in hand. The world feels a little softer now. The noise is a little less harsh. The fire crackles, and the conversations around you start to feel less like a wall of noise and more like a gentle, rhythmic hum. You're a part of this world now. If only for a few hours, the cost of your drink, whatever it was, bought you not just a beverage, but a brief moment of comfort and belonging in a harsh and uncertain world. The thought is calming. You settle in, taking another small sip, preparing for what comes next. You can hear a man telling a story about a runaway pig, and you can't help but smile. Life, you realize, no matter how hard, always finds a way to be a little bit funny. With your mug of questionable ale in hand, you look for a place to sit. The tables are long, rough planks with benches on either side, and they're designed for one thing: maximum occupancy. There are no two-person tables, no cozy booths. Everyone sits together, cheek by jowl, a communal sea of humanity. You find a spot on a bench that's already quite full. There's an unwritten code here, a kind of fluid social etiquette. You simply sit where there's a space, sliding in between two men who barely notice your arrival. Personal space is a modern luxury that simply doesn't exist in a medieval tavern. You're close enough to hear their conversation, smell their breath, and feel the warmth radiating from their bodies. The men on either side of you are deep in a discussion about the recent harvest. Their voices are low, rumbling murmur. You don't try to join in, you just listen. The communal seating isn't just a matter of convenience, it's a reflection of the social fabric, in a world with a vast chasm between the noble and the peasant. The tavern was one of the few places where those lines could blur, if only slightly. You might find a travelling merchant sharing a bench with a local blacksmith and a couple of farmhands. It's a place where information is exchanged, gossip is spread, and connections are made. It's the medieval equivalent of a social network, but with a lot more physical contact and a lot less curated content. A quirky historical tidbit about medieval social norms is the concept of sumptuary laws. These were laws that dictated what people could wear based on their social class. For example, only the nobility might be allowed to wear certain colours like purple or fabrics like silk. These laws were designed to keep social distinctions clear. But in the smoky, crowded tavern, you can see how they might have been a bit harder to enforce. The clothes of a peasant and a merchant might not be that different once they're both stained with spilled ale and soot. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of the population was illiterate. The tavern, therefore, served as a vital hub for news and information. News didn't travel by newspaper, it travelled by word of mouth, from one traveller to another, and the tavern was the first place that news would land in a new town. It was the original town crier, but with a lot more drinking. Historians still argue whether the tavern was a place of true social mixing or if the visible and invisible barriers of class still held strong, with people naturally gravitating toward their own kind. As you sit there, you feel the rhythms of the place. The conversation ebbs and flows, a steady hum punctuated by bursts of laughter. Someone across the table starts a story about a particularly stubborn mule, and the whole table leans in to listen. The stories are simple, but they're told with a kind of folk art precision. There's no dramatic tension, just a straightforward recounting of a humorous or unfortunate event. The entertainment is each other. There's no radio, no television, no Spotify. You are the entertainment, and so is everyone else. You take another sip of your ale. The taste is growing on you, or perhaps you're just getting used to it. The low light and the constant hum of conversation are having a soporific effect. You feel your eyelids getting heavy. This isn't just a place to drink, it's a place to rest, to be among people without the pressure of having to perform. You watch as an old man in the corner quietly whittles a piece of wood, lost in his own world. A young woman, likely a serving girl, bustles by with a heavy wooden platter of food. Her movements quick and efficient. Everything here has a purpose, a role to play. The whole scene feels both foreign and strangely comforting. You realize that despite the dirt and the lack of amenities, this tavern is a place of community, a place where people come to feel less alone in a difficult world. The close quarters seating, rather than feeling claustrophobic, now feels a bit like a warm blanket. Your mug of ale sits heavy in your hand. Its contents are murky, yellowish brown. You can see flecks of something, yeast, grain, floating within. This is not a drink meant to be chilled and served in a delicate glass. This is a drink designed for purpose. It is food. In the Middle Ages, ale was a staple of the diet, a source of calories and nutrients that water simply couldn't provide. Remember, the water from the local well was often contaminated with all sorts of delightful things, from animal waste to industrial runoff. The process of brewing, which involved boiling the water, made the resulting ale far safer to drink. It was a liquid bread. You take another sip. The taste is a little earthy, a little sour, and very different from the crisp, fizzy beers of today. It's also likely warm, as it comes straight from the barrel, kept at cellar temperature. There are no refrigerators or beer coolers here. The flavour is a far cry from the nuanced hops and malts you might be used to. This is a simple brew, likely made from whatever grains were available: barley, oats, maybe even wheat. It's also low in alcohol, what historians call small beer, a low-proof beverage for all-day consumption. And a quirky historical fact is that it was often given to children because it was safer than the water. Imagine a 5-year-old chugging a pint of ale. It sounds insane to us, but to them, it was just part of a healthy diet. A mainstream historical fact is that the quality of ale varied wildly. It depended on the skill of the brewer, the quality of the grains, and the cleanliness of the barrels. A bad batch could make you sick, and a great one was a cause for celebration. Because of this variability, the reputation of a tavern or an alewife was everything. A good brewer was a respected member of the community. Historians still argue whether the perceived benefits of ale were solely due to the boiling process or if the added nutrients from the grains played a significant role in public health. It was certainly a lot more than just a drink. It was a form of sustenance. You watch as the barkeep refills a few more mugs. The process a smooth and practiced rhythm. He doesn't seem to care about the quality, only the quantity and the money. But you know that somewhere in this town, there is likely a woman, an alewife, who takes great pride in her brew, whose reputation rests on the consistent quality of her product. The tavern is a place of commerce, but it's built on the backs of thousands of small, personal acts of labour, from the farmer who grew the grain to the brewer who mashed it. The ale is starting to settle in your stomach, a warm, comforting weight. It's a feeling of being full and relaxed. You can feel the slight buzz of the alcohol, just enough to soften the edges of the day's fatigue. The room feels cozier. The chatter of the patrons a more soothing hum. It's easy to see why these places were so popular. They were a refuge from the cold, the hunger, and the constant physical strain of medieval life. It wasn't about getting drunk as an end goal. It was about finding a little bit of comfort and warmth in a world that offered very little of either. You take one last, long drink from your mug. The dregs are thick with sediment, but you don't mind. You've consumed a piece of history, a flavour profile that has been largely lost to time, replaced by sterile, mass-produced liquids. You appreciate the simplicity of it, the straightforwardness. You're just a person in a tavern, drinking a drink. The world outside, with all its complexities and dangers, can wait. With the mug of ale warming your belly, you start to feel the pangs of hunger. You look around at the other patrons. Most are just drinking, but a few have small platters of food in front of them. The food is simple, hearty, and, like the ale, not particularly delicate. You approach the barkeep again, pointing to the food on the next table. He grunts and disappears into a back room, returning a moment later with a wooden trencher. This is not a plate. It's a thick slab of stale bread, a day or two old, hollowed out to serve as a bowl. This is a common practice in the medieval era. A quirky historical tidbit is that the trencher itself would absorb the juices and sauces, and was often given to the poor or to the dogs after the meal. So not only are you eating your meal, you're eating your plate, or at least the edible part of it. On the trencher is a hunk of cheese, a few thick slices of dark rye bread, and a small, steaming bowl of something that looks like stew. The smell is a welcome change from the smoky, yeasty air. The stew is likely made from whatever vegetables were available, onions, root vegetables, maybe some cabbage, and whatever meat they could get, which might be a bit of salted pork or, if you're lucky, some rabbit. There's no cutlery, so you use your fingers to pull apart the bread and dunk it into the stew. It's a messy, but satisfying, process. This kind of food is known as pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew that was the cornerstone of the medieval peasant's diet. It was easy to make, and you could just keep adding to it over the day. A mainstream historical fact about medieval food is that the diet was heavily dictated by the seasons and the land. There were no fresh strawberries in January. You ate what was available locally and what could be preserved, either through salting, smoking, or drying. The spices you saw at the market are for the wealthy. A poor person's food is flavoured with salt, herbs from the garden, and nothing more. This meant the flavours were simple and repetitive, but the food was designed for pure energy. Think about the amount of calories a peasant would need for a day of hard labour in the fields. A bowl of watery soup just wouldn't cut it. This kind of food was pure fuel. Historians still argue about whether the average medieval peasant's diet was nutritionally sufficient. Some believe it was surprisingly balanced, while others point to evidence of vitamin deficiencies and malnutrition, especially in times of famine. As you eat, you notice that there's no communal sharing of food. Everyone has their own trencher. The conversations around you are still lively, but your own world has narrowed to the task of eating. You are acutely aware of the rough texture of the rye bread, the sharp taste of the cheese, and the earthy, warm flavour of the stew. There's a bone in the stew, which you carefully set aside. You can hear the gnawing sound of a dog under the table, and you wonder if you should give it to him. You probably will. There's a kind of solidarity here, a sense that everyone is in the same boat, trying to get by. The food is just another piece of the puzzle, another moment of comfort in a world that is often anything but. You finish the trencher, and your stomach is full and warm. It's a good feeling. It's a feeling of safety and security, of having enough. In this era, that's a luxury. With a full stomach and a mug of ale now more than half empty, you lean back on the rough bench and start to take in the patrons around you. The tavern is a stage, and the people here are the actors, each with their own story. You notice a trio of travelling merchants in the corner, their clothes a little cleaner, their hands a little softer than the rest. They speak in hushed tones, occasionally gesturing to a ledger book or a piece of fabric. They're probably discussing the price of wool in the next town over, or the dangers of the road ahead. Their conversation is a world away from the loud, boisterous laughter of the peasant at your table. A quirky historical fact is that merchants were often viewed with a mix of suspicion and respect. While they were the lifeblood of the economy, their wealth was not tied to land like the nobility, which made them a kind of social anomaly. They were the original freelancers, living by their wits and their trade, and taverns were their informal meeting places and information exchanges. You see a couple of men playing a dice game. Their faces tense with concentration. They're not playing for a lot of money, probably just a few pennies, but the intensity is real. In a world where work is hard and rewards are few, even the smallest wager can feel like a life-changing event. A mainstream historical fact is that taverns were not just for drinking, they were vital social hubs. They were places where contracts were signed, marriages were arranged, and disputes were settled. Before the age of newspapers and public libraries, this was the primary source of news and community information. You might learn about a new tax, a royal decree, or a recent bandit raid just by listening to the conversations around you. Historians still argue about whether this kind of decentralized information network was more or less reliable than the more formal systems of today. There were no fact-checkers, after all. You had to rely on the word of a total stranger, or a friend who knew a friend. The whole scene is a kind of gentle, living tapestry. A farmer tells a joke, and his friends slap their knees and laugh. A serving girl, her face smudged with soot, navigates the crowded room with a surprising grace. The lute player in the corner, having finally found his rhythm, strums a simple, melancholy tune that feels perfect for the smoky, low-lit room. You're a part of it, not as a participant, but as a silent observer. You're watching history happen in real time, not in a textbook, but in the small and seemingly insignificant details of daily life. The kind of history that doesn't make the news, but makes the world go around. You finish your meal, and the feeling of warmth and contentment is profound. The simple act of eating and drinking in a public space, surrounded by others, feels deeply human. You feel a kind of solidarity with the people around you, a sense of shared experience, of being in it together. The air is still thick with smoke, the benches are still hard, and the floor is still caked with dirt. But it doesn't matter. You're safe, you're warm, and for a little while, you are home. The stories and the laughter are the real sustenance here, a kind of food for the soul, and you are a quiet guest at the feast. As your stomach settles and the ale buzzes gently in your head, you begin to take in the entertainment. In a modern pub, you might find a television, a jukebox, or a dartboard. Here, the entertainment is far more rudimentary and far more social. You watch as a group of men gathered around a table slam down a pair of dice, their voices raised in triumph or disappointment. They're playing what's likely a simple game of chance, maybe something akin to backgammon or dice. The stakes are small, perhaps a few coppers or another round of ale. It's not about the money so much as it is about the competition and the camaraderie. A quirky historical tidbit is that dice were often handmade from bone or ivory, and they were notoriously unbalanced. This meant that winning a game of chance often had as much to do with luck as it did with the imperfections of your dice, which could be a source of constant argument. You also see a game being played with what looks like crude chess pieces, but the board is laid out differently. It's a game called Hnefatafl, or Viking chess, which was a popular board game in medieval Europe. The rules are a bit different, and it's a strategic game that requires a bit of thought, a welcome change from the simple luck of the dice. A mainstream historical fact is that while gambling was widespread, it was also often officially condemned by the church and legal authorities. Taverns were supposed to be regulated, but the rules were often ignored. You'd find laws against cheating, and punishments for gambling debts could be severe, but it was just a part of the culture. Historians still argue whether this widespread gambling was a symptom of the social instability of the time, or simply a natural human desire to take a chance and find a bit of excitement. You see a few other forms of amusement, a minstrel, not the professional kind you might find in a lord's court, but a travelling musician, is strumming a lute in the corner. His singing is off-key, but the patrons don't seem to mind. They sing along with the chorus, their voices blending into a raucous, communal sound. There's no separation between the performer and the audience. Everyone is involved. The humour is also pretty direct. Someone might tell a long, meandering story that ends in a simple, punchy joke. Laughter is loud and frequent. You hear someone recounting a story about a talking goose, and the whole room erupts. The jokes aren't subtle, but they're honest and they come from a shared experience of a hard life. The tavern is a place to forget your troubles, to be loud, and to be a little bit silly. You realize that for the average person, this kind of entertainment was a rare and precious commodity. There were no concerts, no plays, no movies. A travelling juggler or a fire eater was a major event, so the simple games and the shared songs were incredibly important. They were a way for people to connect, to forget their back-breaking labour for a few hours, and to feel like part of a community. The smoky, loud, and dirty tavern is, in its own way, a palace of entertainment, and you are a quiet guest at the feast. You can't help but smile at the sight of an old man struggling to blow a simple tune on a wooden pipe, his cheeks red with the effort. It's a simple joy, but a real one. The light outside is long gone, and the darkness feels absolute, but inside, the fire still burns, the ale still flows, and the laughter continues. As the night deepens, you become aware of the unwritten rules of the tavern, the unspoken laws that keep the chaos in check. There are no bouncers, no security cameras, just the formidable presence of the barkeep and the weight of social expectation. You've noticed that people don't steal from each other, at least not openly. A man might leave his mug on the table to go to the privy, confident that it will still be there when he gets back. This is because the community is small and tightly knit, and a reputation for thievery would get you ostracized in a hurry. A mainstream historical fact is that in medieval towns, social control was often informal and enforced by the community itself, not just by official law enforcement. Gossip and public shame were powerful tools for maintaining order, but there were also formal laws. A quirky historical tidbit is that in some towns there were laws known as assize of bread and ale, which regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. An official would inspect the loaves and the mugs to ensure that the baker and the brewer were not shortchanging their customers. If they were caught, the punishment could be severe, including fines or even being paraded through the town in a public cart, a punishment known as the pillory. The barkeep you see is constantly aware of this. Even if he seems to be paying no mind to anyone, his business, his livelihood, depends on staying on the right side of these laws and the local officials. The tavern, you realize, is a liminal space. It's a place of freedom and escape, but it's also a place of strict, unspoken rules. You don't speak to a woman unless you know her. You don't interrupt a game of dice, and you certainly don't insult the barkeep. To do so would be to invite a world of trouble, not just from the man himself, but from the other patrons who would see you as a disruption to their peaceful evening. Historians still argue whether the formal laws were actually effective or if the informal social pressure of the community was the true force that kept people in line. You watch as a drunken man begins to sing a song. His voice loud and off-key. Nobody shushes him. It's expected. It's a part of the experience. But when he tries to get up and starts staggering, a friend quietly puts an arm around him and steers him back down to the bench. There's a line, and everyone seems to know where it is. It's a kind of organic order that comes from years of shared experience. You are a visitor, but you are not immune to these rules. You feel a subtle pressure to conform, to be quiet, to not stand out, and it works. The night flows on, and the chaos remains contained. A little pocket of warmth and life in a world of cold and darkness. You realize that a tavern is a lot more than just a place to get a drink. It's a social contract, a temporary community with its own laws and its own rhythm, and you're just a part of it, for now. The fire crackles, and the laughter continues, and you feel safe. Your gaze falls upon the master of this small universe, the tavern owner. He's a central figure, standing behind his counter with a proprietary air. He's not a friend to his patrons, nor is he a servant. He is the law, the financier, and the social hub all in one. He knows everyone's name, their business, and probably their secrets. You watch as he calmly breaks up a small squabble over a game of dice with a single, sharp word, and the men immediately back down. His authority is absolute and unquestioned. He's the one who deals with the suppliers, manages the inventory, and makes sure the local constable gets his share of the take to look the other way. A quirky historical tidbit is that in many medieval towns, innkeepers and tavern owners were required by law to keep a log of all their guests, especially travellers, so that local authorities could keep tabs on who was coming and going. This was a form of early surveillance, and the tavern owner was its first line of defence. The owner is a lot more than just a man selling drinks. He is a keeper of records, a local banker who might lend a few coins to a struggling farmer, and a de facto community leader. He is a master of his domain. A mainstream historical fact is that tavern owners were often among the wealthiest and most influential people in their community, second only to the landowning gentry. Their businesses were cash-intensive and often operated as informal banks, moneylenders, and information brokers. Historians still argue whether the tavern owner was a public servant, providing a vital social service, or a ruthless opportunist, exploiting the poverty and desperation of his patrons. You watch him carefully, a study in a life you'll never truly understand. He moves with a quiet, efficient grace. He knows exactly how much ale is in each barrel, and he can tell by a quick glance if a patron has had too much to drink. He has a kind of sixth sense for trouble and a knack for diffusing it before it starts. The place is an extension of him, a reflection of his personality. It's not just a business, it's his life. The very walls of the tavern seem to hum with his energy. You realize that this place, with all its rough edges and simple comforts, is a testament to the hard work and shrewd business sense of one man. He is the quiet force that makes the whole thing run, the anchor in a sea of chaos. He finally looks at you, his eyes meeting yours for just a second. There is no warmth, no welcome, just a cold, appraising look. He sees you not as a person, but as a potential customer, a problem to be solved, or a source of income. And then he moves on, already dealing with the next patron, the next problem, the next transaction. His job never ends. The tavern closes only when the last customer has stumbled out the door. The night is long, and he will be here until the very end. And he will be the first one to wake up in the morning to start it all over again. The tavern is his fortress, his kingdom, and he is its unsmiling king. And you're just one more subject passing through his realm for a few hours, with a full belly and a half-empty mug. You start to consider the economics of your visit. You paid for your drink with a few coins, but what did that actually represent in terms of labour? A mainstream historical fact is that the average daily wage for a skilled craftsman in 14th century England was about 4 pence. While an unskilled labourer might earn only 1 or 2 pence, your mug of ale probably cost a farthing or a halfpenny, a minuscule amount of a penny. This means that for a single day's wage, you could buy a significant number of mugs of ale, perhaps a dozen or more. It sounds like a lot, but you have to consider that this wage was not for a 40-hour work week. A labourer might only work for a few months out of the year, and they had to provide for a family, often with many children. So while your ale was cheap, the money you used to buy it was hard-earned and precious. A quirky historical tidbit is that wages were often paid in kind, not just in coin. A labourer might be given a portion of the harvest, a place to sleep, and a few coins for his troubles. The coins were a supplement, not the primary means of payment. This meant that the economy was more fluid and less dependent on a standardized currency. The value of your coin could change from day to day, and from one town to the next. The price of ale might be a little higher if the harvest was bad, or a little lower if there was a surplus of grain. This fluid, a bit chaotic economic system is something historians still argue about, debating whether it was a more efficient way to manage a pre-industrial economy or a system that left the common person vulnerable to the whims of the market. You watch as a few more people come in, their clothes a little more worn, their faces a little more tired. They have probably been working all day in the fields, and they're here for the same reason you are, a little bit of comfort and a lot of warmth. They pay for their drinks, some with coins, some with a small bundle of firewood. The tavern owner takes it all in stride. He is a master of this kind of bartering, of assessing the value of a small potato or a few eggs in exchange for a few mugs of ale. You realize that your modern concept of a fixed price is a luxury that simply doesn't exist here. Everything is negotiable. Everything is in flux. You finish your drink, and the thought of the cost is still with you. It wasn't just money you spent, it was a little bit of your life, a little bit of your labour. And in this world, that's a precious commodity. You feel a new appreciation for the simple comfort of the tavern, for the fact that a few coins, a few hours of hard work, could buy you this little slice of warmth and community. The fire crackles, and the laughter continues, and you feel a strange sense of contentment. You are a small cog in a vast economic machine, and for now, you are a part of it. The comfort of the tavern is palpable, but it's not enough to fully distract you from the less pleasant realities of medieval life. As you sit, you become acutely aware of the smells, the smoky air, the spilled ale, the unwashed bodies, and the scent of something vaguely foul from the corner. Sanitation, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval cities were incredibly unsanitary. Waste, both human and animal, was often thrown directly into the street. The concept of germ theory was centuries away, so people had no idea that their habits were spreading disease. The lack of proper drains meant that streets were often rivers of filth. You glance down at your own clothes. They're made of rough wool and linen, and they're likely a bit grimy from your journey. Personal hygiene was a luxury, and a quirky historical tidbit is that while public bathhouses existed, they were often viewed with suspicion and were not always safe. Some were even closed down in later centuries because they were thought to be dens of iniquity, a breeding ground for both sin and disease. For most people, a bath was a rare event, and it was often a communal one, with a whole family sharing the same tub of water. Instead of bathing, people would use herbs and perfumes to mask the smells. You can catch the faint scent of dried lavender on a woman who just walked by, a futile attempt to cover up a more profound lack of cleanliness. The air in the tavern, while warm, is thick with the breath of dozens of people, all coughing and sneezing without covering their mouths. You see a man spit on the floor. It's a habit that is both disgusting and, in this environment, terrifyingly effective at spreading sickness. Historians still argue whether the extreme lack of sanitation was the primary cause of the major plagues that swept through Europe, or if a combination of factors, including poor nutrition and overcrowded living conditions, was more to blame. You can't help but feel a little bit uneasy. The warmth and community of the tavern are a comfort, but the invisible world of microbes is a constant, unseen threat. You're a visitor in a world where a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection and where a shared meal could pass on a deadly disease. You take a drink of your ale, a grim reminder that even the liquid in your mug is safer than the water from the well outside. The call of nature, a biological necessity, reminds you of another harsh reality of the medieval world. With no indoor plumbing, you have to venture outside to find the privy. You ask a man at your table where to go, and he just gestures with a thumb towards the back door. You weave your way through the tables, the noise of the tavern fading behind you as you step back into the cold night. The door closes with a heavy thud, and you are plunged into an even deeper darkness. The air out here is frigid and smells even worse than the street you came in on. The narrow alleyway behind the tavern is a mixture of mud, discarded refuse, and something indescribably foul. A mainstream historical fact is that outdoor privies were common. They were usually just a hole in the ground with a small hut built over them, often shared by multiple households. The waste would accumulate and occasionally be shoveled out. A quirky historical tidbit is that people often used leaves, hay, or even moss as toilet paper. It was a far cry from the soft, quilted tissue you're used to. You can imagine the discomfort, especially on a cold night like this. The whole system was incredibly unsanitary and a breeding ground for diseases. The lack of proper sanitation meant that illnesses spread like wildfire, and a simple trip to the privy could expose you to a host of unseen dangers. Historians still argue about whether the primitive sanitation systems of the Middle Ages were a primary driver of the high mortality rates, or if other factors, like malnutrition and poor living conditions, were more to blame. You make your way down the alley, trying not to slip in the mud. The only light is the faint glow from the tavern window and the moon, which is partly obscured by clouds. You find the small, rickety wooden structure. It's just a shack with a hole in the floor. The smell is overpowering, a powerful, pungent odor that makes your eyes water. You can hear the sounds of the tavern from here, the muffled laughter and the distant strumming of the lute. It's a stark contrast between the warmth and life inside and the cold, stinking reality outside. You do your business as quickly as possible, trying not to think about what's lurking in the darkness. You get back to the warmth of the tavern as fast as you can, a newfound appreciation for the rudimentary comforts inside. The fire, the ale, the rough bench, they all feel like unimaginable luxuries after that brief, unpleasant trip into the night. You're reminded, once again, that a medieval tavern is a place of escape, not just from the cold, but from the grim realities that lie just outside its door. And now you're back. A little bit wiser and a lot more grateful for the warmth. The thought of leaving the warm, noisy tavern to face the night again fills you with a sense of dread. The cold is a heavy blanket, and the darkness outside is absolute, not the soft, electric-lit darkness of your world, but a deep, black void. You have to face the journey back to wherever you're staying, and you realize that a simple walk home in this era is fraught with 1,000 dangers. A mainstream historical fact is that travel, especially after dark, was incredibly risky. The roads were poorly maintained, if they existed at all, and there were no streetlights. Bandits and outlaws often preyed on travelers, and a person carrying even a few coins was a prime target. There was no 911 to call, no police force to patrol the streets. You were on your own. A quirky historical tidbit is that people often traveled in groups, not just for company but for safety. It was common for a merchant to hire an armed guard or to join a larger caravan of travelers, especially on longer journeys. A group of people was less likely to be attacked, and there was safety in numbers. You are alone, and the thought of facing that black road makes you reconsider your plans. Historians still argue whether the perceived level of danger was exaggerated by historical accounts or if the medieval world was truly as perilous as it seemed. But you don't have the luxury of an academic debate. You have to make a choice. The alternative to a dangerous night walk is to stay here. In the tavern, you glance upstairs, where you can see a narrow, wooden staircase leading to a second floor. The thought of a bed, even a rough one, is a powerful draw. The tavern is not just a place for drinks and food, it's a place for lodging, for weary travelers like yourself. It's a sanctuary from the dangers of the road, a place to rest your head and prepare for the next leg of your journey. You finish your ale, the last drop a tiny moment of courage and comfort, and you make your decision. You will not risk the journey, you will stay. The tavern owner, you notice, doesn't even have to be asked. He sees the decision on your face, the flicker of fear in your eyes. He just gives a small, almost imperceptible nod. He's seen it 1,000 times before, and the thought of being safe, even for a night, is worth every penny you have. The fire crackles, and the laughter continues, and you feel a strange sense of peace. You are home, for now. You approach the barkeep again, who, without a word, points to the creaking wooden staircase. You pay him a small amount for the night's lodging. The transaction as quick and impersonal as before. The stairs are narrow and steep, worn smooth by countless feet. You ascend, and the sounds of the tavern below begin to fade, replaced by a new set of noises, the creaking of old wood, the faint rustle of straw, and the hushed snoring of other guests. This is not a hotel with individual rooms. This is a common sleeping area, and what you find at the top of the stairs is just a large, open room with a low ceiling and a few small, grimy windows. A mainstream historical fact is that inns and taverns often offered communal lodging. It was common to sleep in a shared bed, sometimes with strangers, and the beds were often just sacks filled with straw or hay. Privacy was a non-existent concept. You find a spot on a cot, a rough-hewn wooden frame with a lumpy sack on top. The sack is filled with straw, which rustles as you lie down. The smell is a mixture of damp hay, unwashed bodies, and stale air. There are a few other people in the room, some already asleep. Their snores are low, rhythmic grumble. A quirky historical tidbit is that people often slept in a semi-upright position because it was believed to be healthier. This practice was also a bit more comfortable on a lumpy mattress made of hay or straw. You might have a thin woolen blanket, but that's about it. The lighting in the room is non-existent. The only light comes from the faint glow of the moon through the window, or a crack in the wall. You are surrounded by darkness and the quiet sounds of sleep. This is not a place of luxury, but it is a place of safety. The door below is locked, and the tavern owner is your protector for the night. You close your eyes. The sounds from the tavern below a distant hum. The smell of hay and people a strange kind of lullaby. You are a long way from home, a long way from a comfortable bed. But you are safe, and that's all that matters. Historians still argue whether the lack of privacy in medieval lodging was a social choice or a simple matter of necessity, a way to make the most of limited space in a crowded world. For you, it's just a reality. You pull the rough blanket up to your chin, and the exhaustion of your long day finally takes over. You drift off to sleep, surrounded by strangers in the heart of the medieval world. And for now, you are safe. You wake not to the gentle chime of an alarm, but to the rough sounds of the morning. A rooster crows, a sound that seems impossibly close, and you hear the muffled clang of a blacksmith's hammer from somewhere in the distance. The air in the room is cold and stale, a stark contrast to the warmth of the tavern's main room from the night before. Sunlight, a thin, dusty blade of light, cuts through a crack in the wall, illuminating the swirling motes of dust in the air. You stretch on your straw-filled mattress, your body protesting the hard surface. The sounds from outside grow in volume, the rumble of carts, the lowing of livestock, and the shouted greetings of merchants and vendors. The city is waking up, and so are you. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval life was dictated by the sun. There were no streetlights, no alarm clocks, and no reason to stay up late. Most people went to bed at sundown and woke up with the dawn. This rhythm of life was a far cry from the 24/7 world you're used to. For a peasant, the day's work began at first light and ended at dusk. You can hear the sounds of this life beginning to unfold, the rhythmic clatter of a hand loom, the shouts of a man selling bread, and the distant, tinny sound of a bell. A quirky historical tidbit is that in many towns, there was a designated bell ringer who would ring a bell at dawn and dusk to signal the beginning and end of the workday. It was a kind of communal alarm clock, a way to keep the town in sync. You get up, your bones aching a little, the room is still dim, and you can see the other guests stirring. You have a moment to yourself before the day truly begins. You make your way downstairs, and the tavern is a different place in the morning. The fire from last night is just a pile of glowing embers, and the air is cold. The tavern owner is already there. Sweeping the floor with a rough broom, he grunts a hello, and you feel a strange sense of belonging, a feeling that you are just another face in his endless parade of travellers. The thought of a warm meal is what drives you forward. You look outside, and the street is already a muddy, bustling river of people and animals. The thought of a cup of hot ale to ward off the chill is the only thing on your mind. You are no longer just a traveller, you are a part of the city's waking life. Historians still argue whether the transition from a nocturnal to a diurnal society in the medieval era was a gradual process or a sudden shift brought on by the increasing urbanization and commerce. You don't know the answer. You're just trying to find a cup of something hot to drink. With a mug of hot ale in your hands and a piece of stale bread for breakfast, you decide to venture outside. The street is a cacophony of sound and a swirl of motion. The sun is just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows. You see people going about their morning chores. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of the population in medieval Europe were peasants. Their lives were dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. Their workday was long, brutal, and often repetitive. You watch a family head out of a small hovel, the man carrying a hoe, the woman with a basket on her arm, and the children trailing behind. Their destination is likely a field outside the city walls. They will spend the entire day toiling in the soil, planting, weeding, or harvesting. Their lives are a cycle of labour, with a few small breaks for food and rest. A quirky historical tidbit is that medieval peasants often had a surprisingly large number of holidays, called holy days, which were mandated by the church. These days off, combined with Sundays, meant that a peasant might have up to 150 days off a year. It sounds like a lot, but you have to remember that when they were working from sunup to sundown. It was all or nothing. The life of a peasant was one of constant physical exertion and an ever-present fear of famine or disease. They were tied to the land, and their lives were often a constant struggle against the elements. You see a man leading a mule, the animal's hooves clattering on the muddy road. The mule is probably the family's most valuable possession, a source of power and labour. Historians still argue about whether the life of a medieval peasant was one of abject misery or a simpler, more spiritually fulfilling existence. Some scholars argue that the community support and the strong faith provided a buffer against the hardships, while others point to the high rates of mortality and the lack of social mobility as evidence of a life of constant struggle. As you watch them, you feel a kind of sadness. Their lives are so hard and and their world is so small. But you also feel a sense of respect. They are the backbone of this society, the ones who provide the food and the labor that makes everything else possible. They are the silent majority, and they are the true heroes of this era. You take another sip of your hot ale, feeling the warmth spread through you. It's a small comfort in a world of endless labor, and you realize that even this simple moment of warmth is a luxury that many will never have. You walk further into the town, drawn by the sound of rhythmic hammering. You come upon a small shop, its door open to the street. Inside, a man in a leather apron is working at a forge, his face and arms streaked with soot. This is a blacksmith, a master craftsman, and a vital member of the community. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval society was organized into guilds, a bit like a modern trade union or professional association. Guilds were powerful organizations that regulated quality, set prices, and provided training. To become a master craftsman, you had to start as an apprentice, then become a journeyman, and finally, after many years, submit a masterpiece to the guild to prove your skill. The man you see at the forge has likely spent decades perfecting his craft. A quirky historical tidbit is that guilds often had their own elaborate rituals, secret passwords, and social gatherings. They weren't just about business, they were also a kind of social club, providing support for members in times of sickness or need. Historians still argue about whether the guilds stifled innovation by discouraging competition or if they provided a stable, high-quality system that protected both the craftsman and the public. You watch the blacksmith work, his hammer striking the red-hot iron with a powerful, rhythmic clang. The sparks fly, and the heat from the forge is a welcome warmth on this cold morning. He is making a horseshoe, a simple object, but one that is absolutely vital in a world that runs on horsepower. He doesn't look at you, focused entirely on his work. You feel a sense of awe at his skill and his dedication. This is a life of purpose, a life tied to the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of the community. There are no 2-week vacations here, no retirement plan, just the work itself, a constant, daily effort to create something useful and beautiful. You turn and continue down the street, the sound of the hammer fading behind you, leaving you with a newfound appreciation for the quiet dignity of labor. The streets are becoming more crowded, and the smells are multiplying. You smell the pungent odor of animal waste, the sweet scent of baking bread, and 100 other indescribable aromas. You're looking for a bathhouse, a place to finally wash off the grime of your journey. You find one down a side alley, a small, unassuming building with a puff of steam rising from its roof. A mainstream historical fact is that public bathhouses were a common feature of medieval cities, inherited from the Roman tradition. They were not just for cleaning, they were also important social hubs. People would go to relax, gossip, and conduct business. A quirkier historical tidbit is that some bathhouses were segregated by gender, but others were not, and the public bathing was often a bit scandalous. You might find people of both genders bathing together, and some bathhouses were even known to have a bit of a rowdy reputation. Historians still argue whether the decline of public bathing in later centuries was due to moral concerns or a misunderstanding of how diseases were spread. You pay a small fee to enter and find yourself in a large, steamy room. The air is thick with moisture and the scent of human bodies. There are a few large, wooden tubs, some of them big enough for several people. You are not alone. There are a few other patrons, their bodies half submerged in the steaming water. You find a free spot and slowly lower yourself into the tub. The water is surprisingly hot, and you can feel your muscles beginning to relax. The steam rises around you, and for a moment, you forget about the cold, the dirt, and the dangers of the world outside. The people around you are quiet, lost in their own thoughts, or whispering to each other. This is a moment of pure, unadulterated luxury. The grime from your journey begins to float away, and you feel a sense of renewal. This is a place of escape, a place where for a little while you can feel clean and human. You can't help but feel a sense of gratitude for this simple luxury, a quiet moment of peace in a loud and chaotic world. You wash your hair with a rough, saponin-based soap, and you feel the weight of 100 worries lifting off your shoulders. This is a small slice of paradise. After your surprisingly therapeutic bath, you feel a bit more human. You walk out into the street, the cold air a shock after the steamy bathhouse. Now, you're more aware of what people are wearing. A mainstream historical fact is that clothing in the Middle Ages was a powerful social signal. The materials, colours, and styles were all dictated by your social class. A peasant would wear simple, rough-spun wool or linen, often in muted, earthy tones like brown, grey, or undyed off-white. Their clothes would be functional, designed for warmth and durability. A quirky historical tidbit is that a man's trousers were often called hose, and they were two separate pieces, one for each leg, tied to an undershirt. This made it easier to go to the privy, but also meant they could be a bit awkward to wear. You see a group of wealthy merchants. Their clothes are a little finer. Their tunics are made of dyed wool, maybe even with some embroidery. The colours are a little brighter, a bit more vibrant. The richest would be wearing silk or velvet, with bright colours like blue, red, or even purple. You remember the sumptuary laws we talked about earlier? These laws were designed to keep the social classes visually separate. A peasant was not allowed to wear the same colours or fabrics as a noble. Historians still argue whether these laws were an effective tool for social control or a futile attempt to stop the rising merchant class from imitating their betters. You look down at your own clothes, and you feel a kind of freedom. You are a neutral party, a blank slate, and you can move through this world without anyone knowing your social standing just by looking at you. You see a woman with a magnificent headpiece called a hennin, a tall cone-shaped hat that looks like it would be a bit of a pain to wear. It's a sign of her high status, a kind of billboard for her wealth. The clothes here aren't just for comfort, they're a language, a complex code that tells you who you are, what you do, and where you belong. You feel a strange sense of liberation, but also a sense of being lost, a person without a clear place in this complex social hierarchy. You continue down the street, and the clothes of the people you see tell 1,000 stories. Each one a small piece of the vast tapestry of medieval life. Your stomach is full, your body is clean, and you feel ready to face the day. As you walk, you notice a small crowd gathered around a man with a cart. He's not selling food or goods, he's selling medicine, or, at least, that's what he claims. He has a few jars and bottles on his cart, and he's speaking to the crowd with a theatrical flourish, promising to cure everything from a sore throat to the plague. This is a quack doctor. And a mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine was a bizarre mix of folk remedies, superstition, and ancient theories. A common theory was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A doctor's job was to restore this balance, often through bloodletting or purging. You watch as the man on the cart sells a small vial of something to a woman who is coughing. You have no idea what's in the vial, and you're pretty sure it's not going to help her at all. A quirky historical tidbit is that doctors often used astrology to make a diagnosis. The position of the stars and planets was believed to influence the humours in the body, and a good doctor would consult a star chart before making a diagnosis. This was considered cutting-edge science. Historians still argue whether the medieval doctors were simply charlatans or if they were doing the best they could with the limited knowledge they had. The line between a doctor and a magician was often blurred, and a lot of the remedies were based on folklore and superstition. You see a man selling what he claims is unicorn horn powder, a surefire cure for all sorts of ailments. You know it's a fake, probably made from a narwhal tusk, but the people around you seem to believe him. The lack of scientific knowledge and the ever-present fear of death made people desperate, and these quack doctors were more than happy to exploit that desperation. You continue on your way, feeling a strange sense of gratitude for the modern world's medical advances. You realize that in this era, a simple cold could be a death sentence, and the only hope was a man with a cart and a jar full of something you can't identify. You've had enough of the quack doctor and his dubious wares. You push through the crowd and find yourself in a large, open square. This is the heart of the town. The public market. The square is a riot of colour, sound, and smell. Tents and stalls are set up in a maze-like pattern, and people are packed shoulder to shoulder, haggling and shouting. The air is filled with the scent of fresh bread, roasting meat, and 100 other aromas. This is where the world comes to meet. A mainstream historical fact is that the market was the central hub of a medieval town. It was where people from the surrounding countryside would come to sell their goods and where townspeople would come to buy them. It was a place of commerce, a place to see and be seen, and a place to catch up on the latest gossip. A quirky historical tidbit is that merchants often had a toll or tax they had to pay to the lord of the land to be able to sell their goods in the market. This tax, or market fee, was a significant source of income for the local nobility. The market was a world unto itself. You see a man selling fresh fish from a cart, his voice a hoarse shout. A woman is selling eggs and chickens, her face framed by a simple wimple. There's a man selling shoes, another selling knives, and another selling woven baskets. The whole scene is a vibrant, living tapestry of medieval life. The lack of supermarkets or department stores means that everything you need, you get here. Historians still argue whether the medieval market was a free market system or a highly regulated one, controlled by the guilds and the local lord. The truth is probably somewhere in between. You're jostled by a man carrying a sack of grain, and you apologize, but he just grunts and moves on. The pace of life here is fast and chaotic. It's a place of business, and there's no time for pleasantries. You realize that this is the beating heart of the town, the engine that makes everything else run. As you navigate the crowded market, you notice a stall that's a little different from the others. It's not selling bread or shoes or vegetables. It's selling small packets of spices, brightly coloured fabrics, and intricately carved trinkets. These are luxury goods, and they came from a long, long way away. A mainstream historical fact is that the trade routes from the east, like the Silk Road, brought a dizzying array of spices, silks, and jewels to Europe. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were incredibly valuable and were often used as a form of currency. They were a sign of wealth and were used to flavour food, to make medicine, and to preserve meat. The man at the stall, probably a merchant from a faraway city, looks tired but content. His goods are a testament to the vast, interconnected world that existed even in the Middle Ages. A quirky historical tidbit is that spices were often used to disguise the taste of spoiled or rotting food. A bit of pepper could make a piece of meat that was a little past its prime taste a lot better. This was especially important in a world without refrigeration. You see a woman buying a small pinch of cinnamon, her face a mixture of excitement and awe. This is a rare luxury, a small indulgence that she will savour. The cost is probably a small fortune to her, maybe a week's wages, but to her, it's worth it. Historians still argue whether the desire for spices was the primary driver of the age of exploration, or if it was a happy side effect of the search for new trade routes. You feel a sense of wonder. You are a long way from a world where you can buy a bottle of cinnamon for a few dollars. Here, it's a rare and precious commodity, a small taste of a world you've only read about. The spices in the jars are a kind of magic, a link to a faraway land, and the man selling them is a kind of wizard. You take a final look, and you move on. The smells of the market a little bit more complex now. As you leave the market square, you hear the distant, sonorous sound of a church bell. The sound is a constant presence in medieval life, a kind of auditory clock that marks the hours, signals the beginning and end of the workday, and calls the faithful to prayer. A mainstream historical fact is that the church was the single most powerful institution in the medieval era. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the government, the school, the hospital, and the social club all in one. The church owned vast tracts of land, it had its own laws and courts, and it had a powerful influence over every aspect of a person's life. From birth to death, you pass a small church, its doors open, and you can see a few people kneeling in prayer. The building itself is simple, but the feeling of reverence is palpable. A quirky historical tidbit is that the church bells were often given names and were believed to have magical powers, like warding off storms or evil spirits. The bell ringer was a respected member of the community, and it was a job that was often passed down from generation to generation. Historians still argue about whether the church's power was a force for good, providing stability and a moral framework, or a force for oppression, stifling free thought and scientific inquiry. The church was both a centre of learning and a place that burned heretics at the stake. It was a complex institution, and its influence was both a blessing and a curse. You see a group of monks walking in a line, their heads bowed in prayer. They are a living embodiment of the church's power and influence. Their lives are dedicated to God, but their institution is a central part of the temporal world. The sound of the bells follows you as you walk, a constant reminder of the unseen, but all-pervasive power of faith in this world. The sounds of the town are a constant, chaotic symphony, but you hear a different kind of noise, a high-pitched giggle and a few whispered shouts. You turn a corner and see a man, his clothes a bit mismatched and his hair a bit wild. He's talking to himself, and a group of children are following him, giggling and pointing. This is the village idiot. And a mainstream historical fact is that in many medieval towns, there was a person with a mental or physical disability who was a sort of fixture in the community. Their treatment was often a mixed bag. Some were cared for by the community, others were seen as a source of amusement, and a few were even seen as being touched by God and were treated with a kind of reverence. Their existence was a stark reminder of the lack of medical knowledge and the very different attitudes towards mental health. A quirky historical tidbit is that in some villages, a person with a mental disability was believed to have a special connection to the spiritual world, and their words were sometimes seen as a kind of prophecy. They were often referred to as fools or idiots. But these terms weren't always meant to be insulting. It was just a way of describing a person who was a little different. Historians still argue whether the treatment of the mentally ill in the Middle Ages was more or less humane than in later centuries. While they were not institutionalized, they were also often marginalized and vulnerable. You watch as a woman gives the man a piece of bread, and he takes it with a grateful smile. The children who were taunting him are now quiet, watching him eat. It's a small moment of kindness in a harsh world. You realize that a medieval community, for all its faults, was a place where everyone had a role to play, even if it was just as the village idiot. As you walk, you hear the quiet chatter of two women. One of them is telling a story about a neighbor who cured her child's fever with a poultice of boiled herbs. This is a world where medicine and magic are often indistinguishable, and folk remedies and superstitions are a part of daily life. A mainstream historical fact is that before the advent of modern medicine, people relied on a vast body of folk knowledge, passed down through generations, to treat illnesses. This included everything from herbal remedies to rituals and prayers. A quirky historical tidbit is that some folk remedies were quite bizarre, including the use of crushed worms for stomach pain or spiderwebs to stop bleeding. Some of these remedies, like willow bark for pain, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, actually worked. Most, however, did not. The woman continues her story, now talking about a charm she wears to ward off the evil eye. The belief in evil spirits, curses, and magical creatures was widespread. People believed in fairies, goblins, and a host of other supernatural beings. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were a form of social control, a way to explain the unexplainable, or a genuine belief system that existed alongside the formal doctrines of the church. You can't help but feel a little bit of the magic of it all. It's a world where the lines between the natural and the supernatural are blurred, and where a good harvest or a sick child could be explained by 100 different forces, both seen and unseen. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the world around you, a world where a simple ailment is not just a medical problem, but a spiritual one, and where the cure might come from a handful of herbs or a whispered prayer. It's a world where you're never truly alone, but you're also never truly safe from the forces of fate. As you leave the village, you look up and see it in the distance, a looming, grey shadow on a distant hill. The castle. It's a powerful symbol of the vast chasm between your humble life and the life of the nobility. A mainstream historical fact is that the feudal system was a rigid social hierarchy based on land ownership. The king was at the top, and he granted land to his nobles, who in turn granted land to lesser nobles, and so on. At the bottom of this pyramid were the peasants and serfs, who were tied to the land and worked for the lord in exchange for protection. The castle is the physical embodiment of this system, a fortress of power and privilege. It's a place of immense wealth and influence, and its inhabitants live a life that is a world away from yours. A quirky historical tidbit is that castles were not just for living, they were also a kind of early bank. The lord would often store his gold and his valuables in a heavily fortified room in the castle, and it was a common practice for him to lend money to other nobles or even to the king. Historians still argue about whether the feudal system was a stable, mutually beneficial arrangement, or a brutal system of oppression that kept the vast majority of the population in a state of servitude? For you, the answer is clear. The castle is a constant reminder of your place in the world. It's a symbol of a life you can only imagine, a life of warmth, of luxury, of power. You walk on, but you can't help but look back at it. It's a silent, unblinking eye on the world. A fortress of power that watches over you and everyone you know. It's a world you'll never be a part of, but it's a world that dictates every aspect of your life. The castle is a symbol of the Great Divide, and you are on the wrong side of it. As you walk along the dirt road, you see a young man, perhaps a few years older than you, carrying a large leather pouch and a sword that looks a bit too big for him. He's walking with a purpose, a look of grim determination on his face. This is a squire, a knight in training, and a mainstream historical fact is that knighthood was a profession that was both revered and grueling. A young man from a noble family would be sent away at a young age, sometimes as young as 7, to be a page in another lord's household. From there, he would become a squire, and his job was to serve his knight, helping him with his armor, his horse, and his weapons. It was a life of servitude and hard work, a kind of military apprenticeship. A quirky historical tidbit is that a squire was not just a servant, he was also expected to be a kind of social chameleon, learning how to dance, sing, and play an instrument. He was expected to be a man of both war and art. Historians still argue whether the concept of chivalry was a genuine moral code or a romanticized ideal that was rarely practiced in the brutal world of medieval warfare. The young man you see is a living embodiment of this dual life. He is a servant, but he is also a future leader, and his life is a constant cycle of training and service. The sword he carries is a symbol of his future, a weapon he will one day use to defend his lord and his king. You see him stop and practice a few sword strokes, the blade glinting in the morning sun. It's a dance of death, but it's also a kind of art. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense effort that goes into the life of a knight. It's not just a title, it's a life of constant work, a life dedicated to a single purpose. As you approach the town square again, a small crowd has gathered. In the center of the crowd, a man is locked in a wooden frame, his hands and head protruding from 3 holes. This is the pillory, a form of public punishment. And a mainstream historical fact is that medieval justice was often brutal and public. Punishments were designed to be a deterrent and a form of public shaming. The pillory was used for minor offences, like cheating a customer, but it was also a place where the public could hurl insults and rotten vegetables at the offender. A quirkier historical tidbit is that in some towns, the pillory was also used as a place to publicly read out new laws or decrees. It was a kind of public bulletin board, a place where everyone could be informed. You watch as a man in the crowd throws a rotten apple at the man in the pillory. The apple hits him in the face, and the crowd roars with laughter. It's a form of entertainment, a public spectacle. The man in the pillory, you learn, was caught selling watered-down ale. It's a minor crime, but in a world with no consumer protection laws, it was considered a serious offence. Historians still argue whether the brutal nature of medieval justice was a reflection of a more violent society or a necessary tool for maintaining order in a world without a formal police force. You feel a strange mix of pity and fear. You are a long way from a world with a jury of your peers and a fair trial. Here, the court of public opinion is the only one that matters. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the invisible line between a law-abiding citizen and a criminal. It's a thin line, and it's a line you don't want to cross. As you leave the town, you find yourself on a muddy path that cuts through a large, cultivated field. You see a man and a woman working the land, their backs bent over the soil. They are serfs, and a mainstream historical fact is that a serf was not a slave, but they were not free either. They were tied to the land and were the property of the lord who owned it. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission. They had to pay taxes in the form of labour and a portion of their crops, and they had to ask the lord for permission to get married. A quirky historical tidbit is that the lord often had the right to seize the best animal from a serf's farm after they died, a practice known as heriot. It was a form of inheritance tax. You watch as the man works the soil with a simple plough, a heavy, wooden tool that is both a symbol of his toil and a testament to his strength. The woman is weeding by hand, her fingers moving with a kind of practiced rhythm. Their lives are a constant cycle of planting, harvesting, and paying taxes. Their existence is one of constant struggle and limited opportunity. Historians still argue whether the serfs lived a life of constant misery or whether the system provided them with a kind of stability and protection in a chaotic world. You feel a strange sense of sorrow. Their lives are so hard, and their world is so small. They will live and die on this piece of land, and they will never know anything else. You walk on, but you can't help but look back at them. They are a living embodiment of the feudal system, a world of haves and have-nots, and you are just a traveller passing through. With the sight of the serfs fading behind you, your thoughts turn to food, and the stark contrast between the daily diet of the rich and the poor. A mainstream historical fact is that the food you ate at the tavern, simple as it was a kind of luxury. The diet of a medieval peasant was monotonous and repetitive. It was based on grains, like rye or barley, made into a thick porridge or bread, and a few vegetables that they could grow in their own gardens, like cabbage and onions. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions like a feast day or a wedding. The rich, however, ate like kings. Their tables were laden with meat, roasted swans, wild boar, and venison, and they had access to exotic spices and fruits that the poor could only dream of. A quirky historical tidbit is that the rich often ate their meals with their hands, and they would use a piece of bread as a kind of spoon to scoop up the food. The concept of a fork was a luxury that hadn't yet been widely adopted. The poor, of course, had no cutlery at all. They ate with their fingers, and the shared trencher of bread was a common sight. Historians still argue whether the diets of the rich, with their heavy emphasis on meat and sugar, were actually less healthy than the diet of the poor, which, while monotonous, was often more balanced. You can't help but think about the simple meal you ate at the tavern, and you realize that even that simple meal was a moment of luxury in a world of haves and have-nots. The rich had their feasts, and the poor had their bread and pottage. It was a world of stark contrast, and you were a witness to it. You continue on your way, a little bit more aware of the invisible lines that divide the world, a line that is often drawn with a fork, or a lack thereof. Your mind returns to the ale you drank at the tavern. It was murky and warm, but it was also a lifesaver. A mainstream historical fact is that in the Middle Ages, water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination from human and animal waste. Brewing beer or making wine required boiling the water, which killed off most of the harmful bacteria. This made fermented beverages a much safer alternative to water for everyone, including children. As we touched on earlier, a quirky historical tidbit is that monasteries and convents were often some of the most skilled brewers in the land, and they would produce a variety of beers and wines, not just for their own consumption but to sell to the public. They were the original craft brewers, and their recipes were often passed down through generations. The importance of beer and wine went beyond just safety. They were also a source of calories and nutrients, especially in the winter months when food was scarce. A person might drink a gallon or more a day, and it was a staple of their diet. It was a liquid form of sustenance, a kind of bread in a cup. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of low-alcohol beverages had a significant impact on public health. Some scholars argue that it helped to prevent disease, while others point to the social problems that came with widespread drinking. You can't help but feel a kind of strange gratitude for that warm, murky drink you had at the tavern. It was more than just a drink, it was a way of life. It was a source of warmth, of comfort, of safety. It was a small piece of a complex world, a world where the simplest things could be a matter of life and death. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the invisible thread that connects the things we drink to the lives we live. You walk on, and the path you're on widens into a well-travelled road. You pass a small port, a collection of wooden docks and a few small boats. This is a hub of medieval trade, a place where goods from all over the world come and go. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval world was a lot more interconnected than we often imagine. Trade routes, both by land and sea, crisscrossed the globe, and goods from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East found their way to Europe. A quirky historical tidbit is that the Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of merchant guilds and market towns, dominated trade in northern Europe for centuries. They had their own laws and their own private armies, and they were a major economic force. You see a group of men unloading barrels from a ship. The barrels are probably full of wine or ale, or maybe even salted fish. A few men are carrying sacks of grain, their backs bent under the weight. The sounds of the port are a symphony of commerce, the creaking of ropes, the shouted orders of the men, and the rhythmic splash of water. This is the engine that drives the medieval world, the commerce that makes everything else possible. Historians still argue whether the vast trade networks of the Middle Ages were a force for social progress, spreading ideas and knowledge, or a source of exploitation, enriching a few at the expense of many. For you, the answer is clear. This is a place of life and purpose, a place where people are working together to build something bigger than themselves. You feel a sense of awe at the sheer scale of the operation, the immense effort that goes into moving goods from one place to another. You walk on, but you can't help but feel a little bit of the energy of the place. Your journey has taken you to the edge of the town, but the conversation turns to a far more sinister topic. You hear people speaking in hushed tones about the sickness or the plague. A mainstream historical fact is that the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. It swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. The cause of the plague was unknown at the time, and people attributed it to everything from God's wrath to bad air or miasma. The disease was carried by fleas on rats, which were a common sight in medieval cities. A quirky historical tidbit is that doctors often wore a beak-like mask filled with sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the bad air, a practice that was as ineffective as it was theatrical. You feel a sense of dread, the air is cold, but you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. The town you've been in, with its crowded streets and lack of sanitation, is a perfect breeding ground for such a disease. You see a family in mourning, their faces drawn with grief. You hear a bell toll, a signal that another person has died. The plague wasn't just a physical disease, it was a social one. It tore communities apart, it broke up families, and it instilled a deep, abiding fear in everyone. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of the plague. Some scholars argue that it led to the collapse of the feudal system, as a lack of labour gave peasants more power and freedom, while others argue that it simply exacerbated the existing social problems. You walk on, but you can't help but look at every person you see with a new sense of fear. They are all potential carriers, and you are all a potential victim, seeking a moment of peace. You find yourself at the gates of a monastery. The walls are thick and high, and the air inside is still and quiet. A mainstream historical fact is that monasteries were centres of learning and art in the Middle Ages. They were the keepers of knowledge, and the monks and nuns who lived there were often the only people who could read and write. They would spend their days in prayer, but also in study, copying and illuminating manuscripts by hand. A quirky historical tidbit is that the ink used in these manuscripts was often made from natural materials like soot, egg whites, and even ground-up insects. The colours were incredibly vibrant, and the illustrations were breathtakingly beautiful. You are allowed inside, and you find yourself in a large, silent room with a few monks bent over tables, their faces illuminated by the light of a single candle. They are painstakingly copying a book, their quills scratching on the vellum. The air is filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax. You see a book with a magnificent illustration of a dragon, its scales painted in brilliant green and gold. The work is slow and meticulous, and it would take years to complete a single book. Historians still argue whether the monks were preserving knowledge or if their focus on religious texts stifled the advancement of scientific knowledge. You feel a sense of awe. In a world with no printing press, a book was a rare and precious object, and these men were its creators. They were not just scribes, they were artists, and they were the guardians of a world of knowledge. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense effort that went into a single word, a single line, a single book in this world. The silence of the monastery is a welcome change from the noise of the town, and you feel a strange sense of peace. As you walk away from the monastery, the complex web of medieval society comes into sharper focus. You've seen the peasants, the merchants, the craftsmen, and the nobles. This entire system, from the highest lord to the lowest serf, is bound together by feudalism. A mainstream historical fact is that feudalism was a social, political, and economic system where land was the basis of all power. The king, at the top, owned all the land, and he granted it to his most loyal nobles in exchange for their military service. These nobles, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser nobles, and so on, creating a chain of loyalty and obligation. The peasants and serfs, at the bottom, worked the land in exchange for a small plot of their own and the protection of the lord. A quirky historical tidbit is that the entire system was based on a handshake and an oath. There were no written contracts, and a lord's word was his bond. Historians still argue whether feudalism was an effective system for maintaining order and stability, or if it was a brutal system of exploitation that stifled social mobility and kept the majority of the population in a state of poverty. You can see the evidence for both arguments. You've seen the security that the system provides, but you've also seen the immense inequality. The castle on the hill is a testament to the power of the few, and the back-breaking labour of the serfs is a testament to the powerlessness of the many. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the invisible lines that bind everyone in this world together. It's a complex, brutal, and often beautiful system, and you are a witness to it. You've seen the men working, fighting, and praying. Now, you begin to notice the women. A mainstream historical fact is that the role of women in the Middle Ages was heavily dictated by their social class. A noblewoman might be a powerful figure in her own right, managing a castle and its lands while her husband was away at war. A peasant woman would work alongside her husband in the fields, but she was also responsible for all the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, and raising the children. Her life was one of constant, back-breaking labour. A quirky historical tidbit is that some women, especially widows, had the right to own and manage their own businesses. They could be brewers, weavers, or even tavern owners, and they had a surprising amount of legal and economic independence. You see a woman haggling fiercely with a merchant over the price of a chicken. She's not just a housewife, she's a savvy businesswoman. You see a group of women working in a field, their clothes caked with mud, their faces tired but determined. You see a nun, her head covered, her face serene. She has chosen a life of piety and service, a life outside the confines of marriage and family. The life of a woman in the Middle Ages was not just about serving a man, it was a complex tapestry of roles, from mother to merchant to nun. Historians still argue whether women had more freedom and power in the medieval era than in later centuries. You feel a sense of respect. The women of this era were not just silent partners in a man's world, they were a vital, powerful, and often overlooked part of the social fabric. As you walk back towards the town, you see a small group of boys gathered around a man with a book. They're sitting on the ground, their faces a mixture of concentration and boredom. This is a scene of medieval education, and a mainstream historical fact is that education was a rare luxury in the Middle Ages, reserved for the very wealthy or those who were destined for a life in the church. The vast majority of the population was illiterate, there were no public schools, and a child's education was often limited to learning a trade from their father. A quirky historical tidbit is that the curriculum in a medieval school was based on the 7 liberal arts: the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was a curriculum designed to prepare a student for a life of theological study, not a life of business or trade. You watch as the man with the book points to a letter, and the boys try to sound it out. It's a slow, painstaking process. There are no blackboards, no pencils, just a single, precious book and a group of boys with a hunger for knowledge. Historians still argue whether the lack of widespread education was a primary factor in the slow pace of scientific and technological progress in the Middle Ages. You feel a sense of gratitude for the world you live in, a world where knowledge is so freely available. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense value of a simple book, a single piece of paper, a single word. As you re-enter the town, you see a small crowd gathered in a circle. In the middle of the circle, a man in brightly coloured clothes is juggling 3 small balls. This is a jester. And a mainstream historical fact is that jesters, or fools, were a common form of entertainment in medieval courts. Their job was not just to make the king laugh, but to provide a kind of social commentary. They were the only people who were allowed to speak the truth to power without fear of reprisal. A quirky historical tidbit is that jesters were often highly intelligent and skilled, and they were experts in comedy, music, and storytelling. They were a bit like a medieval comedian. and their humour was often biting and sarcastic. You watch as the jester makes a silly face, and the crowd roars with laughter. He's not just a fool, he's an artist, and he's a master of his craft. He tells a joke about a greedy lord, and the crowd laughs nervously. He is a living, breathing testament to the power of humour to lighten the burden of a difficult life. Historians still argue about whether the jester was a force for social change, a kind of truth-teller in a world of lies, or if he was simply a safety valve, a way for the powerful to release a little bit of pressure. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense power of a single joke, a single song, a single moment of laughter. You've seen the commerce and the trade, but you still have a vague, uneasy sense of the economy. You come across a money changer at a small stall in the market. He has a scale and a few piles of different coins, and he's carefully weighing each one. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval currency was incredibly complex. There was no single, unified currency. Instead, there were a hodgepodge of different coins from different kingdoms, each with its own value. And a money changer's job was to figure out the value of each one. A quirky historical tidbit is that coins were often clipped or shaved around the edges by unscrupulous people to steal small amounts of silver or gold. A money changer would look for these imperfections and refuse to accept the coin. You watch as a man hands the money changer a handful of coins. The money changer carefully weighs each one, and then hands the man a smaller pile of different coins in exchange. The man looks a bit disgruntled, but he accepts the deal. It's a world where the value of your money can change from one town to the next, and a money changer is a powerful man who controls the flow of wealth. Historians still argue whether this complex and often confusing system was a primary driver of the slow pace of economic growth in the Middle Ages. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the invisible forces that govern the world. It's a world where a single coin can be a symbol of immense wealth or a worthless piece of metal, and the difference is often in the hands of a single man. As you make your way out of the town, you pass by the gates of a large convent. It is a world of quiet contemplation, a world away from the noise and chaos of the town. A mainstream historical fact is that the life of a monk or nun was one of service, prayer, and study. They lived in a closed community, cut off from the outside world, and their lives were dictated by a strict set of rules. They would spend their days in prayer, but also in manual labour, farming the land, or copying manuscripts. A quirky historical tidbit is that many monasteries were also places of great innovation, and they were often at the forefront of agricultural and technological advancements. They developed new methods of farming, new ways to brew beer, and new ways to make wine. You see a group of nuns walking in a garden, their heads bowed in prayer. Their lives are one of quiet contemplation, but they are also a vital part of the social fabric. They provide care for the sick, food for the poor, and a home for orphans. Historians still argue whether the monastic life was a spiritual escape from the world or a form of social service that was vital to the functioning of society. You feel a sense of awe. The lives of these men and women are a testament to the power of faith and the immense effort that goes into a life of service. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the different ways people found a purpose in this world. You're now on the outskirts of town, and you see a small hut, a single-room dwelling made of mud and straw. This is the home of a peasant family. A mainstream historical fact is that a medieval home was a simple, one-room dwelling with a thatched roof and a dirt floor. There was no furniture to speak of, just a few rough benches and a table. The entire family would sleep together on a bed of straw, and the fire in the centre of the room was used for both warmth and cooking. A quirky historical tidbit is that the smoke from the fire had to escape through a hole in the roof, which meant the air inside was often thick with smoke. This was not just a health hazard, it was also a way to preserve meat, which was hung from the rafters to be smoked. You can see a woman stirring a pot over the fire, her face streaked with soot. A few children are playing on the floor, their clothes a little too big for them. This is the world of the average medieval person. It's a world of simple, brutal realities. There's no privacy, no comfort, no luxury. But there is a kind of warmth, a sense of family and community. Historians still argue whether the medieval home was a place of hardship or a place of a strong, familial bond. You feel a sense of gratitude for the simple luxuries you take for granted. A bed, a roof that doesn't leak, and a home with walls that keep out the smoke. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense value of a simple roof over your head. As you walk along the main road, you see a group of men training with wooden swords and shields. This is a glimpse into the brutal world of medieval warfare. A mainstream historical fact is that warfare was a constant presence in the Middle Ages. The life of a soldier was one of constant training, and the weapons they used were a far cry from the sleek, high-tech weapons of today. A soldier would use a simple sword, a spear, or a longbow, and their armor would be a heavy, cumbersome suit of mail or plate. A quirky historical tidbit is that the English longbow was so powerful that it could pierce a knight's armor from 100 yards away. It was a kind of a game-changer in medieval warfare, and it gave the common foot soldier a new kind of power on the battlefield. You watch as the men practice their moves, their faces grim with concentration. This is not a game, it's a matter of life and death. The difference between a well-trained soldier and a poorly trained one could mean the difference between victory and defeat, and the difference between life and death. Historians still argue whether the brutal nature of medieval warfare was a necessary tool for maintaining a fragile peace or a constant source of social upheaval and suffering. You feel a kind of sadness. The men you see are not just soldiers, they are farmers and craftsmen, and they have families at home. They are a living embodiment of the constant threat of violence that hung over the medieval world. You walk on, but you can't help but look back at them. They are a kind of quiet, powerful force, a force that both protects and destroys. As you walk, you feel a subtle change in the air. The wind is a little colder, and the sky is a little greyer. You've been here for a while, and you realize that you've experienced more than just a place. You've experienced a season. A mainstream historical fact is that the rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the turning of the seasons. The spring was a time of planting, the summer was a time of growth, the fall was a time of harvest, and the winter was a time of scarcity and cold. The seasons were not just a part of the year, they were a part of life, a constant, powerful force that dictated everything from what you ate to what you wore to how you lived. A quirky historical tidbit is that people often had to kill a portion of their livestock in the fall because they didn't have enough food to feed them through the winter. This autumn slaughter was a major event, and it provided a much-needed source of meat for the winter months. You can feel the air getting colder, a signal that the long, cold winter is coming. The trees are bare, and the fields are a muddy, brown expanse. The sun sets earlier, and the days are shorter. You can see people hurrying home, their faces a little more drawn, a little more tired. The winter was a time of hardship, a time of constant struggle against the elements. Historians still argue about whether the long, cold winters of the Middle Ages were a major factor in the high mortality rates. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense power of nature, a power that could be a blessing in the summer and a curse in the winter. You are just a small part of this vast, natural cycle. The last rays of the sun are fading from the sky, and you begin your long, slow walk home. You've been a traveller, a visitor, and a witness to a world that is both a long way from yours and strangely familiar. You've seen the warmth and community of a tavern, the hard work of a peasant, the skill of a craftsman, and the power of a lord. You've seen a world of brutal justice and quiet contemplation, of scientific ignorance and artistic brilliance. You have walked on streets of mud, breathed air thick with smoke, and seen sights that were both beautiful and terrifying. And now, you are going home. The moon is rising, and the stars are beginning to appear. The world is getting quieter, the noises of the day fading away into a soft, low hum. The fire you had at the tavern seems so long ago, a distant memory of warmth and comfort. You're tired now, a kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from a long journey. The path is getting a little harder to see, but you know the way. The air is still, and you can hear the quiet sounds of the night, the rustle of a small animal in the bushes, the distant howl of a dog. You are a long way from a comfortable bed, a warm room, a hot shower, a full refrigerator. You are in the middle of nowhere, in a time long ago. The world you're leaving behind is not a perfect one. It's a world of immense hardship, of constant struggle, of fear and uncertainty. But it's also a world of a kind of beauty, a world of quiet dignity and immense courage. The people you met, the stories you heard, the things you saw, they are all a part of you now. They are a part of a tapestry, a history that is both beautiful and terrifying. You feel a strange sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the simple comforts you have, for the simple fact that you don't have to live in this world, and gratitude for the people who did, the people who endured and survived and built a world that would one day lead to yours. You are almost home now, and the thought of a warm bed, a soft blanket, and a long, peaceful sleep is the only thing on your mind. The sounds of the world are fading away, and your breathing is getting slower. The air is getting colder, but you feel a warmth inside, a warmth that comes from a long journey and a quiet reflection. The wind is a gentle whisper, and you close your eyes. The world fades away into a quiet hum, and you are almost home. You are almost asleep, and now you are sleeping. As you walk along the main road, you see a group of men training with wooden swords and shields. This is a glimpse into the brutal world of medieval warfare. A mainstream historical fact is that warfare was a constant presence in the Middle Ages. The life of a soldier was one of constant training, and the weapons they used were a far cry from the sleek, high-tech weapons of today. A soldier would use a simple sword, a spear, or a longbow, and their armor would be a heavy, cumbersome suit of mail or plate. A quirky historical tidbit is that the English longbow was so powerful that it could pierce a knight's armor from 100 yards away. It was a kind of a game-changer in medieval warfare, and it gave the common foot soldier a new kind of power on the battlefield. You watch as the men practice their moves, their faces grim with concentration. This is not a game, it's a matter of life and death. The difference between a well-trained soldier and a poorly trained one could mean the difference between victory and defeat, and the difference between life and death. Historians still argue whether the brutal nature of medieval warfare was a necessary tool for maintaining a fragile peace or a constant source of social upheaval and suffering. You feel a kind of sadness. The men you see are not just soldiers, they are farmers and craftsmen, and they have families at home. They are a living embodiment of the constant threat of violence that hung over the medieval world. You walk on, but you can't help but look back at them. They are a kind of quiet, powerful force, a force that both protects and destroys. As you walk, you feel a subtle change in the air. The wind is a little colder, and the sky is a little greyer. You've been here for a while, and you realize that you've experienced more than just a place. You've experienced a season. A mainstream historical fact is that the rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the turning of the seasons. The spring was a time of planting, the summer was a time of growth, the fall was a time of harvest, and the winter was a time of scarcity and cold. The seasons were not just a part of the year, they were a part of life. A constant, powerful force that dictated everything from what you ate to what you wore to how you lived. A quirky historical tidbit is that people often had to kill a portion of their livestock in the fall because they didn't have enough food to feed them through the winter. This autumn slaughter was a major event, and it provided a much-needed source of meat for the winter months. You can feel the air getting colder, a signal that the long, cold winter is coming. The trees are bare, and the fields are a muddy, brown expanse. The sun sets earlier, and the days are shorter. You can see people hurrying home, their faces a little more drawn, a little more tired. The winter was a time of hardship, a time of constant struggle against the elements. Historians still argue about whether the long, cold winters of the Middle Ages were a major factor in the high mortality rates. You walk on, a little bit more aware of the immense power of nature, a power that could be a blessing in the summer and a curse in the winter. You are just a small part of this vast, natural cycle. The last rays of the sun are fading from the sky, and you begin your long, slow walk home. You've been a traveller, a visitor, and a witness to a world that is both a long way from yours and strangely familiar. You've seen the warmth and community of a tavern, the hard work of a peasant, the skill of a craftsman, and the power of a lord. You've seen a world of brutal justice and quiet contemplation, of scientific ignorance and artistic brilliance. You have walked on streets of mud, breathed air thick with smoke, and seen sights that were both beautiful and terrifying. And now, you are going home. The moon is rising, and the stars are beginning to appear. The world is getting quieter, the noises of the day fading away into a soft, low hum. The fire you had at the tavern seems so long ago, a distant memory of warmth and comfort. You're tired now, a kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from a long journey. The path is getting a little harder to see, but you know the way. The air is still, and you can hear the quiet sounds of the night, the rustle of a small animal in the bushes, the distant howl of a dog. You are a long way from a comfortable bed, a warm room, a hot shower, a full refrigerator. You are in the middle of nowhere, in a time long ago. The world you're leaving behind is not a perfect one. It's a world of immense hardship, of constant struggle, of fear and uncertainty, but it's also a world of a kind of beauty, a world of quiet dignity and immense courage. The people you met, the stories you heard, the things you saw, they are all a part of you now. They are a part of a tapestry, a history that is both beautiful and terrifying. You feel a strange sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the simple comforts you have, for the simple fact that you don't have to live in this world, and gratitude for the people who did. The people who endured and survived and built a world that would one day lead to yours. You are almost home now, and the thought of a warm bed, a soft blanket, and a long, peaceful sleep is the only thing on your mind. The sounds of the world are fading away, and your breathing is getting slower, the air is getting colder, but you feel a warmth inside, a warmth that comes from a long journey and a quiet reflection. While the wind is a gentle whisper, and you close your eyes, the world fades away into a quiet hum, and you are almost home, you are almost asleep, and now you are sleeping. End of script. Sweet dreams.